Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on an argument you see thrown around with cooperative games all the time, or games that happen to have a co-op mode in them, but can be played solo. And that is the argument of, well, this game is fun with friends, and it's usually thrown around in response to something like what I do, where I'll review a game, and I'll mostly be reviewing it from playing it solo, and they'll just say something like, oh, well, you might not have had fun with this game, but it's fun with friends. Well, the prime example of this kind of game is what you're seeing in the background, which is the early access build of V Rising. It is a sort of vampire survival-ish game in the similar vein to Valheim, and it explicitly says on the Steam page, travel alone or explore the world with friends. Fighting side by side with other vampires will give you an advantage in the fight to conquer the greatest threats of Vardoran. Now, it also goes on to say that you can compete with other players, and that's really dependent on the server you're playing on. It'll either be PvE or PvP, and naturally I looked at the travel alone statement as meaning, oh, you can play this game solo, and you can play it in a single player context. So I tried to do that, and you can't really play this game in proper single player. Technically what you're doing is creating a private server if you try to play this single player, and you're still subject to weird server connection issues and such like that because it's not actually a single player experience. It is entirely an online experience, and they had to patch in the ability to play the game offline. Although, what they mean by offline is you boot it up in offline mode and play it that way. It's really weird. I don't know why they did it this way, but whatever the case, you may as well just assume this game is actually a multiplayer game, just with the ability to play it on a private server and de facto play it single player. Now, you can change the server settings when you're initially starting up your game, but once you have started up the server for the first time, all of those settings are set, and you can't change them anymore without going into INI files and messing around with those, and the INI files have absolutely no documentation for them whatsoever, so good luck with that. Obviously, these are issues that could certainly be fixed over time. They could eventually just patch in the ability to change the server settings while in-game. They could eventually give us documentation on the INI files so we can mess around with those, or the community can do it themselves eventually. But suffice to say, since this game is in early access, a lot of things in it are subject to change over time. I'm certainly not going to say the game isn't going to get better over time, because there is a decent likelihood that it will get better over time. We just don't know yet, because early access is always a coin toss. At any rate, point is that I went into this game primarily as a single-player context because I knew that I wasn't going to bother with the PvP at all, because honestly, this kind of game in PvP is miserable, and I have no idea why people enjoy that. So playing it PvE seemed like the best thing to do, and I can either do that single player or de facto single player, or co-op. The thing is that nobody I know who has the game had it at the time I started messing around with it, so by the time they had started getting their games up and started playing with their buddies, I had already put a few hours into the game and made a decent amount of progress on building out a small fortress and such like that. And progress doesn't carry over between servers. You only have your character on that one server, and whatever progress you've made while playing on that server is just whatever progress you have on that server. If you want to go to a new server, you have to start the entire thing over again. And by the time my friends started playing the game and started messing around with it on their servers, I didn't want to go through the early game again. Because in the early game, you feel extremely weak, and you have barely any options for doing just about anything. There are barely any materials you can gather, there are barely any things you can build, there are relatively few enemies you can fight, and frankly, it's just not very fun at all. So I decided, you know what, I'm not going to go through the early game again, I'm going to stick with this for a while and see if it gets any better. And it never did. You see, the way the power leveling works in this game is that however strong you are is based entirely on what gear you have. Which effectively means that it doesn't matter how many enemies you fight, it doesn't matter which enemies you draw blood from, it doesn't matter what abilities you have access to. All that matters is what you can craft. And you can only craft things that you have the recipes for, even if you have all of the resources and you know what resources you need and in what amounts you need them. And those crafting recipes are locked behind boss fights, so the actual progression in the game never actually feels like you're getting more powerful as a character. It just feels like, oh, cool, I have new gear. That means I can fight an enemy with a different number on it. And once you realize that, it's really hard to feel like a badass vampire, so already I was having severe issues with the core gameplay mechanics of V Rising. That's not to say that those won't change over time, and I certainly hope they do. Because in its current state, you're just getting absolutely demolished by bandits, and it's basically impossible to feel like a badass vampire with that. So what's even the point of the game? Well, the point of the game is what people will constantly tell you if you try to play it solo, which is, you really shouldn't do that. You should play it with friends, because it's fun with friends. This leads me to the argument itself. You may say it is self-evident that playing a co-op game in solo is going to be miserable. But that's not necessarily the case, and more importantly, if the game is capable of being played solo, then it should be enjoyable in that solo mode. It might be better with friends, but it should still be enjoyable in solo play, and something like V Rising is not enjoyable in solo play, which means that you have the argument of, well, just don't play it solo, play it with friends. Well, here's the problem with that. I have a really weird work schedule compared to most people, which means that if I'm trying to play something in co-op with friends, normally I can't do that. So even if a game is built around co-op, more often than not, I'm effectively forced to play it solo. You may say, well, just play it with randos online. Well, I can technically do that, but that kind of defeats the point of this whole argument of it's better with friends, right? Because if I'm playing with random people online that I don't know, then it's effectively up to random chance as to whether I'm actually going to have a good time or not. And I actually have a similar problem with playing games that require a lot of teamwork. So that's one of the issues I've had with something like, say, Hell Let Loose, with trying to review that recently. The entire experience of a game like that is entirely predicated on how well your team works together. And if your team doesn't work well together, then you're not going to have a good time. Same kind of thing happens in a game like V Rising or these other games that are meant to be played in co-op that are supposedly better with friends. If you are playing them with friends, you generally know how to work together with those people. And if you're playing with randos online, then you have no idea how to work together with these people, because it takes quite a while of trying to work together to really understand what makes that whole relationship click. And frankly, the older I get, the less I want to put up with that process, so I usually just stick to, if it is a co-op game and I have the ability to play it with a specific set of friends, I will just do that, if I even have the time to do it when they're available, because chances are, our work schedules are going to conflict. So there's problem number one with the whole it's better with friends. It's just a simple matter of logistics. You can't necessarily always play it with your friends, and since in a game like V Rising, your progress is locked to whatever server you're playing on, you're sort of locked into your choice there. And if I were playing this with friends on their server, I would basically have to only play the game when they're available, which means that I basically wouldn't be able to get anything done with it. I know that is a bit of a personal issue more than anything else, but the simple fact of the matter is that scheduling conflicts between friends are an extremely common thing, whether it's with co-op video games or stuff like tabletop games or just hanging out in general. So that's just a practical consideration you have to keep in mind, but what about the fundamental problem with the argument itself? Well, the real problem with this argument isn't necessarily that it's wrong outright, it's that it's used as an excuse. You see, a game being better with friends is more or less a foregone conclusion, no matter what that game is. It could be a single-player game entirely, and if you're playing it with your friends hanging out with you, you're going to have a better time than if you were just playing it by yourself. Because you'll be able to joke around, make fun of the game, or maybe they'll point out something that you didn't think about, or you'll work to solve puzzles together, or whatever the case may be. So that game may well be great on its own, but you're still having more fun playing it with friends. And if it's a game that's multiplayer, obviously, whether it's versus or co-op, you're going to have more fun playing it with people you know and trust and know you can have fun with to begin with, because they're going to elevate the experience for you, whether you're actually having fun playing the game itself or not. It could be one of the worst, most miserable games you've ever played, but if your friends are there along for the ride, then you're gonna still be able to get something out of it. Doesn't matter what it is. That's the problem with this argument. Just saying, oh, well, it's better with friends, or, oh, you're not having any fun solo, just play it with your friends. It's actually fun if you play it with friends, is this pathetic excuse that gets thrown around for really crappy game design. You see, as far as I'm concerned, if a game can be played in cooperative mode, then it should be able to stand on its own as a single-player experience before you even consider adding some sort of co-op play. The exception to this is if the game is designed from the ground up as a cooperative experience that cannot be played solo. So think of something like, say, It Takes Two or A Way Out, these games by Hazelight that are specifically designed entirely as co-op games and have no single player whatsoever. In a situation like that, saying it's better with friends is really just an obvious statement and no longer an excuse. Because at that point, you have nothing to assess by playing it by yourself. You have to play it with someone else. Is it going to be better playing it with a friend than some random person online? Absolutely. That is just an obvious foregone conclusion. But you're not saying it as an excuse at that point. It's just a natural part of the entire co-op experience that game is designed around. But unfortunately, that's just not the kind of thing you see with people saying it's better with friends. It's almost always being used as an excuse to prop up a game with a bunch of crappy design principles that make it absolutely miserable to play in solo, but if you're playing it with your buddies, obviously you can get something out of it. And the fact that I do so often see this used as an excuse to prop up crappy games is utterly baffling to me. I just don't understand why people would go into a game, find that it's crap when they're playing it solo, and then when it comes time to recommend for or against the game, they downplay the single player's crappiness because they got some enjoyment out of playing the co-op, so they say it's still worth playing in co-op. That's just utterly ridiculous to me. Because if you're not having fun playing something solo, then the entire reason you're enjoying playing it with friends is that you're spending time with your friends, and frankly, if you're not enjoying the thing you're doing with your friends, but you're enjoying that time with your friends, you'd just be better served doing something else that you all actually enjoy doing. And if you take nothing else away from this video, just take that away from it. I feel like it's just better to spend time with your friends doing things you all actually enjoy doing, not playing a crappy video game that just happens to be enjoyable if you're playing it with your friends, but not if you're playing it by yourself. You are just better off spending your time and money on things that are actually enjoyable on their own to begin with before you start introducing them to your friends and having an even better time with them. So I guess to summarize the whole thing here, I just find it incredibly irritating when people use something like, well, playing this is better with friends as an excuse, and more often than not, that's what I see it as. I usually don't see it being used in a context of, well, this game's great on its own, but it's even better with your friends. It's almost always, this game is crap if you play it by yourself, but it's better with your friends, so it's somehow worth playing if you're playing it with friends. So weirdly enough, I always see it's better with friends as a bit of a red flag at this point. It's a real shame that it's come to that point, but that's where we're at these days. And sadly enough, because I see that kind of thing so often, I'm actually getting to the point where I'm thinking about writing off co-op games entirely just because I don't really have the time to be able to play them with friends because our schedules don't overlap enough. And more importantly, it's just so often used as a sort of crutch to prop up what is otherwise a crappy game, and I'm just tired of dealing with that crap. And as for the likes of V-Rising, well, maybe I'll come back to it eventually, but as it stands, I really don't have any desire to keep playing this thing right now. It's in early access, so hopefully it gets better over time, and I'll eventually take another look at the 1.0 release or whatever they're going to call that. Although, there's also a decent chance that it never gets to that point because the developer is known for abandoning their projects, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. At any rate, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you like my content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.